I'm going to share with you my number one hack to stop losing with pocket jacks, the jiggities. This video is for Brad Owen and everybody else who struggles with pocket jacks. Pocket jacks is a pretty good no-limit Texas Hold'em hand if a lot of money does not go into the pot. When stacks are medium or deep, if your opponent wants to put in a lot of their money or all of their money on pretty much any betting round, if all you have is pocket jacks that is not improved, it shrivels up substantially. And you're going to find that pocket jacks is often either a weak premium made hand or a strong marginal made hand after the flop. And those hands very often want to put in one or two bets, not bets on the flop and the turn and the river. So you're going to have to play it accordingly. First, let's discuss some pre-flop strategy with pocket jacks. You must stop automatically re-raising with it, especially if your opponent's range should be very strong, such as pocket jacks and better, ace king, and a few bluffs. Your pocket jacks is actually behind. For example, say you raise from first position and somebody in middle position 3-bets you. If you 4-bet and they want to get all the money in, your jacks are going to be in horrible shape because they're going to have aces, kings, queens, and ace king. So you're going to find that very often when you face a re-raise before the flop, just calling and seeing the flop is fine. And that's going to result in you getting stacked way less often right off the bat. Recognize that in order to succeed at poker, no limit Texas Hold'em, you must become well versed at post-flop play, which does mean navigating some spots that feel kind of dicey. It also means letting your pocket jacks go when the board is not so great for you. Let's take a look at some game theory optimal charts where in this scenario, we are 100 big blinds deep. Here we're raising the low jack, and then the big blind 3-bets you. This is a spot where your low jack raising range, which is under the gun 6-handed, should be quite strong. It's just these hands that are not in gray. And when the big blind 3-bets, their range should also be very strong. The hands in red are putting in the 4-bet, and the hands in green are calling, and the hands in blue are folding. Notice the only hands that put in the 4-bet are pocket aces, pocket kings, ace king offsuit, and then a few bluffs. And I would actually recommend against most players in most games to not even have very many bluffs because they're not 3-betting you with nearly enough bluffs themselves. So take a look at the calling range. Some ace kings, some pocket kings, queens, jacks, 10s, 9s, 8s, 7s, 6s, 5s. These are all folding some portion of the time. I would not fold against most people unless they make it really big. Plus good, strong suited Broadway hands. Notice though, very importantly, pocket jacks never 4-bets. Even queens doesn't 4-bet every single time or much at all. Doesn't 4-bet at all. It just calls and sees the flop in position. That is something a whole lot of people don't do. Let's take a look at a spot where ranges are much wider now, 100 big blinds deep. You raise the button, and the small blind 3-bets you. This is a spot where the small blind should 3-bet a lot of their playable range, so they just have a good, strong linear range. And in this scenario, you'll see, again, pocket jacks not 4-betting every single time, about, call it 55% of the time, but exploitatively against most players in most small and medium stakes games, because they are not 3-betting often enough to begin with, you in turn should 4-bet less often, especially for thin-ish value. And as you can see, pocket jacks is only 4-betting 45% of the time or so, which implies it's a very thin value bet. So if anything, against most players in most games, I would recommend calling and going to the flop. Now let's discuss 40 big blinds deep in a tournament where ranges are a decent amount wider. Let's take a look at the low jack versus an under the gun raise. So they just make it 2 big blinds. Notice pocket jacks only 3-bets half the time. It calls the other half of the time. And again, if your opponents raise under the gun a little bit too tightly, you should 3-bet less often. If you do 3-bet the jacks in this scenario and you get 4-bet shoved all in against, you do have to call it off. Jacks is good enough to call it off in the spot, but notice it doesn't really want to be in that situation to begin with, so it just calls. Notice queens, 10s, 9s, all of these hands are mixing it up between calling and re-raising because the initial raiser's range should be very, very strong. What about if you raise the low jack to 2 big blinds and the big blind 3-bets you to something like 6.5 big blinds? Notice now, pocket jacks does not go all in. It just calls and sees the flop. We do have some all-ins with ace king, pocket queen, some queen jack suited as a bluff, some ace x suited as a bluff, pocket 10s. But notice jacks just calls, all the lower pairs just call and try to flop a set, aces and kings slow play. This is not a spot where you want to be getting all the money in with pocket jacks, even 40 big blinds deep. Now, as stacks get shorter than 40 big blinds, such as 30 big blinds or 12 big blinds, getting in with the jacks becomes very reasonable because you're essentially not risking all that much, right? If you can only lose 20 big blinds, you're not risking all that much. But whenever a lot of money has to go into the pot, especially if your opponents are going to be slightly tighter and more aggressive than they should in Game Theory Optimal world, you in turn need to make a point to play substantially tighter with your strong but non-premium hands. Now let's discuss post-flop play with pocket jacks. After the flop, like we discussed earlier, jacks is usually either a weak premium made hand or a strong marginal made hand, which means you often want to do a decent amount of checking. Now, if there's an overcard on the flop to your pocket jacks, an ace, a king, or a queen, pocket jacks often plays very passively on at least one betting round and sometimes more, especially as there are more overcards on the board. Also, if you bet with pocket jacks on any betting round, on pretty much any board that doesn't contain a jack, and you get raised, your jacks shrivels up to a bluff catcher. And if your opponent is under bluffing, all of your bluff catchers should fold. Now, if you have an overpair, like say a pocket jacks on 7-4-2, it's a bluff catcher that actually beats some value hands. To be very clear, a bluff catcher is a hand that loses to all value hands and beats all the bluffs. Sometimes pocket jacks will be much stronger than that, right? And if you do get the jacks on the 7-4-2 board for 30 big blinds, you're going to lose all your money. Such is life. You cannot dodge getting stacked with jacks every single time. People always ask, how do I learn to not lose all my money to a set? Well, sometimes it happens. Let's take a look at a few examples, though. Here we have pocket jacks playing 1-2 no limit hold'em. We raise it up. Big blind. I'm not big blind. Button calls. Flop comes. King, queen, 6. We check. Opponent bets. $7 and a 13. This is a spot right off the bat where, as much as I hate it, folding is okay. Now, some players will automatically take a stab at the pot anytime you check. So you want to make sure against those players you protect your checking range by checking some kings and queens. But most players in the spot who call on the button and then bet medium, or especially if they bet large on the flop, they just have a good hand they're trying to get value from and or protect. So if your opponent is on the tighter side, and if you know they don't just automatically blast it when you check to them and they play more reasonable, you should just fold automatically on the king, queen, 6 with your pocket jacks. It sounds nitty, but you have to consider, do you have much potential to improve on the turn and or river? Unless you backdoor straight, it's not going to be good for you, right? Now, if you had a hand like 6-5 suited or ace-6 suited, you would definitely continue, even though that hand is in theory worse than pocket jacks, because ace-6 or 6-5 has 5 outs to improve to 2 pair and or trips, right? But whenever you only have 2 outs to improve, and even if you get a decent turn, like a 10, you don't love it because if you check and your opponent bets again, you can't really fold, but you're stuck calling with a junky open-ended straight draw. You just want to get out of the way early. Sounds nitty, but that's often going to be the right play. Oh, spoiler alert. Here you have pocket jacks. In this hand, we raise it up to 250, playing 100 big blinds deep at 50, 100. Big blind calls. Flop comes. King, 9, 7. Big blind checks. What should we do with our pocket jacks in this situation? Take a second. Think about it. If you want to commit, let me know what you would do in the comment section down below. While you're down there, click the like and subscribe button. Click the notification bell. This is a spot where you should simply check it back. You may say, but I raised pre-flop. Does not matter. This is a board where your opponent's going to connect somewhat well with it in general. They're going to have some kings, which obviously are in not great shape against. They will have some worse hands like a 9 or a 7. But notice if you let it go check, check, the 9s and 7s aren't going to outdraw you all that often. And in this scenario, you really don't want to get check raised. That would be awful, because then you either have to call with what is obviously a bluff catcher because it loses to all value hands, mainly a king. But it does beat a lot of bluffs, so it's a pretty junky scenario for you. So simply check it back. If you told me you wanted to value bet this because you think your opponents are going to be too straightforward, I love that. And I'm sure in Game Theory Optimal world, checking it back, betting or checking in this scenario is acceptable. But against most players, I think checking it back's great, especially if you think they're going to be a little bit too loose and a little bit too aggressive on the turn and or river, thinking that when you check it back, you must have nothing. And a lot of players in a lot of games, especially online on websites like CoinPoker, they're going to be thinking that when you check it back on the flop. You must be very weak. And if they think you must be very weak, they'll try to bluff the turn. They'll try to bluff the river. You'll go call, and you'll scoop a nice pot. It started drilling over my head. Hopefully you all don't hear that. Turn is a queen of clubs. Big blind checks. This is an awful turn for you. One of the worst cards in the deck. You really did not want an ace or a queen on the turn, and they put it right there. Check it back again. Notice, so far we raised pocket jacks. We've checked it back on the flop. We've checked it on the turn. Just playing a small pot. River's a 2 of spades. Opponent checks. Now at this point, we should go for value. If the opponent had a king, they would probably bet the turn and or river. If they had a queen, they probably bet the turn and or river. So it's highly likely we have the best hand in this situation. And as long as you don't expect your opponent to check raise too incredibly aggressively, simply betting the river and then folding if you get raised is going to be great. Now, this is a pretty decent hand to call a check raise with because you block your opponent's nut hands with Jack 10. And you also block maybe a thin check raise with King Jack, which might be something. So I think in this scenario, if you bet, you should probably call it off in Game Theory Ultimate World. That said, you're going to have to make a read, right? So in this spot, we do go for 400, 2/3 pot. Opponent does call. By the way, when you value bet on the river, you do not need to win every single time when you get called. Because, well, your opponent's going to be calling with a whole lot of worse stuff. You typically need to win roughly half of the time, maybe a little bit more when we are reopening the action. So this is a spot where we can go for value. Ace-9 calls us and we win a nice pot. Now, a lot of people say, what if my opponent bets the river after it goes check, check, flop, check, check, turn? What do we do? Again, call. We have induced bluffs. When you play your hand in a manner that looks kind of weak, a lot of players, if they're sitting here with any hand that cannot logically win at showdown, they will go for a bluff. And some players may take a hand like Ace-9 or Jack-9 and value bet it on the river. So whenever you do check down, you certainly are not trying to fold. So that's it for today. Pocket Jacks is pretty good if a lot of money does not go into the pot. As soon as you realize your hand has become a marginal made hand, checking is very often a reasonable play. So make sure you play the pocket jiggities accordingly. Good luck in your games. Have fun. If you have a friend who always cries about pocket jacks, they keep hammering above my head. Perfect timing, everyone. If you have a friend who always complains about pocket jacks, send him this video. They'll be eternally grateful. I'll talk to you next time.